They say light itself dies in the warp. That once you cross the veil, there is no velocity fast enough, no will strong enough, no soul bright enough to escape its grasp. But imagine, for one blinding instant, that something tried. Not a ship guided by a navigator's trembling faith, nor a psyker screaming through madness, but a man who believes he can outrun death itself. In another universe, he was called the fastest man alive, a streak of crimson lightning tearing through time and causality. In this one, he is a myth carried by the static between dying Vox signals, a story whispered by rogue traders and missionaries who swore they saw a red light flicker across the Imperium, moving faster than even thought. They say it screamed. They say the warp screamed back. If that sounds impossible, good. Because in the 41st millennium, impossible is just another word for about to be devoured. And yet, if a speedster tried to pierce the warp, what would he find? What would the warp do to someone who moves not through space but through time itself? Before we dive into that nightmare, anchor yourself. Like this chronicle, share it with the faithful. And subscribe your vigilance, for beyond this point, even the Emperor's light flickers. The Arc Mechanicus Cantus Ferrum drifted like a cathedral unmoored from gravity, its spine of adamantine vaults and incense-blackened engines suspended above a swollen scab in real space, where the void puckered and breathed. The Magos called it a controlled singularity, a pinprick where the immaterial lapped at the hull as if tasting iron. But the crew whispered rift and made the sign of the Imperial Aquila, when the klaxons fell silent and the incense coils hissed. I stood at the edge of the primary observation sanctum, palms damp inside parchment gloves, while a choir of servo skulls circled the dome and trailed prayer ribbons sticky with unguents. Machine oil and cold copper lay on my tongue. I could hear the faint click of my data slate against my belt with every nervous breath, and somewhere in the walls a servitor's Vox grill stuttered out a metered litany to soothe the reactor's temper. I had been embedded as Logister Savant Marwin Hale for 6 months by an Ordo Xenos attaché, who preferred to remain a name scratched into a sealed briefing. My function was simple: record without interpretation, observe without fear. It is easy to accept those instructions when the thing you are meant to observe is a diagram in a catechism. It is harder when it is a wound. Magos explorator Calix Thane was high upon the gantry, a bare silhouette against the sanctum's stained ports, his mechadendrites moving like a slow crown of iron serpents around his bald, tattooed scalp. His voice, when it came, was softened by speakers, a metallic baritone that wore the cadence of prayer even when it spoke in numbers. Vox Quietus confirmed. Reactor latches at 97%. All stations hold. Initiate the 9th cant to bind velocity. Around me, adepts in red robes knelt, their breath fogging through rebreather flanges as they pressed auger tines to the deck and sang the cant in a monotone hum that vibrated the bones. Velocity in the cant of the Mechanicus was not a thing to be celebrated. It was a property like temperature or mass which must be tamed by naming. The 9th cant syllables were designed to dull edges. Below the gantry hung the machine the Magos had built to insult the border between worlds. It was not elegant. Nothing honest ever is. A cage of crystalline ribs held an ovoid chamber lined with blackened mirrors etched in hexagrammic wards and scrap code blessings hammered by a Skitarii chaplain whose hands never stopped trembling. Braided conduits thicker than a man's torso fed into a cruciform that pulsed with a heartbeat the ship had not given. I watched the oscilloscopes raster uncertain alphabets. On my data slate, the test bore the name Project Canticle of Motion Revision 17. In the private notes I kept for myself, the ones no one would ever see, I called it the net. Calix Thane lowered a hand. Commence microtranslation. The words tasted of cold. At once the chamber's mirrors fogged from within, not with condensation but with depth, as if the glass had remembered it could be water. The rift beyond the dome dilated in sympathy, a bruise spreading under pale skin. I felt it in the hyoid bone of my throat and in the curve of my inner ear, a pressure shifting against no wind. The cantor's hum slipped 1/2 tone lower. I tapped the corner of my slate, time stamping with ritual precision. Voidships initiation. A moment later, every lumen in the sanctum seemed to grow a halo, and the smell of incense sweetened into something like rain striking hot metal. The first thing we saw was light. Not a beam, not a flare, not the patient radiance of a lumen globe finding reflective purchase, but a filament so thin it seemed more suggestion than presence. a seam of color tight as a blade's edge that quivered between the chamber and the rift beyond the dome. It was red, but red the way memory is red, full of heat you cannot quite touch. The filament skipped once, twice. A stuttering heartbeat bridged across realities, and every unaugmented eye in the sanctum began to water at the same instant. A servitor hiccuped steam. Someone whispered a prayer by reflex and stopped, ashamed. I wrote on my slate, 0-9, luminal anomaly present. Chromatic designation, crimson. What I wanted to write was that the void had spoken a syllable, and it was written in the color of arterial blood. Maintain containment, the Magos said. His mechadendrites reached, tightened, released. On the lower decks, I could hear the skittering feet of Secutari adjusting their perimeter, feel their presence like teeth behind my shoulders. The filament vibrated more rapidly, and the chamber's mirrors began to smoke where the red line brushed their edges. The smoke moved against gravity, pooling at the ceiling and then sinking as if some unseen tide pulled it through us. The Vox picked up a thin keening not produced by any mouth. Every needle on every gauge crept toward rupture, and then, by some private agreement with the machine's soul, held there as if unwilling to be the first to step over the threshold. Calyx, I heard myself say before I had permission to speak. It's not reflecting, it's searching. He made no sign he had heard me. Perhaps he had, and the computation required to deem my words unhelpful had simply not risen to the level of expression. Instead, he extended his primary mechadendrite toward a control lectern, and a shrine servo dutifully tipped a tiny vial of sanctified promethium over the brass keys as an offering. The keys clacked. The chamber's mirrors reoriented in microscopic degrees that made the light look like a drawn bow. The filament bent, kinked, snapped taut, and for an instant it was no longer a line but a figure, a human width streak, a smear of form pulled thin by its own speed, the suggestion of limbs folded into the geometry of velocity. It was gone in the blink that named it. Every lumen in the sanctum dimmed to a candle's grief. We had the recording. Calyx had built the net to paralyze frames of motion, to trap speed in a series of mechanical prayers whose sum would be proof. On my slate, the image collapsed into numbers and the numbers into frequencies. The choir's hum faltered, then steadied. Someone sobbed once and became silent. I can say, because I saw it and because the figures do not lie in the way men do, that there was a human outline inside that streak. I can also say, because I'm not a fool, that human is a big word. I had heard, in the way rogue traders tell heresies as if they are simple weather, the rumor of a figure in another telling of reality, who outran thunder and his own shadow. Fastest man alive, they say, as if alive were something speed could be. I had always filed those tales beside ghost ships and emperor-shaped clouds, but the net's readout called the thing we had touched a crimson frequency, and the name sat in my throat like a shard. It was not passive. That was the second truth. The red filament returned, not as a line now, but as a ripple, a wave that learned the shape of our mirrors and then ignored it. The chamber's hexagrammic wards pulsed with dull warmth and then went cold. Not extinguished, but outthought. Where the filament brushed the wards, scripture peeled like paint from rusted iron. The Mechanicus adepts redoubled their hum until the sound thickened the air. I felt the deck rise and fall under my boots with the slow tide of the ship's discomfort. It's reading us, I said, like a hand on a page. Only later would I wonder why I chose that metaphor and whether I had been thinking of the reverse. Calyx finally turned his head. One of his human eyes on the left remained a washed-out gray. It did not look at me. It looked through the dome into the rift as if to dare it to blink. We will name it, he said. Naming tames. His voice was a scrape of iron filings. Increase power by 3%. There is no sound like the sound of a machine obeying. It is not loud, not in the way battle is loud. It is the absence of argument. The chamber brightened, the filament convulsed, and for a heartbeat the sanctum was illuminated by the color that lives inside arteries and fires and warnings. Over the vox came a choir we had not invited. Some syllables did not pass through my ears but wrote themselves across my teeth. Syllables that meant both now and never and always in the same taste. The filament struck the mirror at a shallow angle and spread, not diluted but multiplied, a fan of red threads combing the chamber. Where they passed, the air sounded like torn silk. A servo skull drifted too low and came apart as if a careful hand had separated bone from wire. When I tried to step forward, my legs refused in a tremor I could not command. I watched Calyx descend 3 steps along the gantry with the terrible grace of a man who has replaced fear with purpose. His mechadendrites arced in a cage around him. "Hold," he said, not to us but to the thing, as if words could be thrown like net weights. "Hold." The red threads braided themselves together into a single streak that crossed the sanctum and touched the inner face of the observation dome. Not glass, layered crystal flecks and faith. Yet I saw a hairline fissure draw itself across the pane like a quill stroke. It did not break, it wrote. A single line, then a second, perpendicular. The beginnings of a sigil without meaning, or with a meaning I could not bear to recognize. The choir's hum broke. Somewhere below, a secutari shouted and was cut off mid-cry. I did not realize I had raised my slate until I saw the reflection of my own frightened eyes in its obsidian face. Calyx lifted his right hand. The mechadendrites withdrew like startled snakes. He made the sign of the cog with a fingertip whose nail had been replaced by a brass cap, and then, unaugmented, reached toward the control lectern as if to soothe the machine by touch. The crimson streak pivoted, almost playful, and hovered above his palm like a living wire. I smelled the iron of fresh blood, though none had been shed. "You are a function," he told it, and I understood that he was talking to himself. "You can be named." The streak brightened in a way that felt like laughter. The hair on my neck lifted. He pressed the override sigil. The chamber sang. The mirrors flared white-hot, then black with stress fractures. Every lumen died and was reborn in the space between heartbeats. For a single instant, the filament became a figure again. Longer this time, drawn across its own length. A man dragged through a keyhole by a god that did not care about bone. I saw the suggestion of a face turned toward us. Not pleading, not accusing, but measuring. Magos Calyx Thane began to smoke at the edges where robes meet air. Strands of fiber curling into ash that lifted without heat. He did not move. He held his palm out as if in benediction or greeting, and the red light pooled in it like a promise no oath could keep. The red light pooled in Calyx's palm like a living thing tasting the air. For a fraction of an instant it hesitated, then sank through flesh as if the concept of solidity were no longer relevant. The Magos convulsed, not with agony but with astonishment, as though some equation he had carried in silence for decades had suddenly balanced. His flesh blistered outward into vapor, leaving chrome bone. The streak flared, expanding through the sanctum in a single sigh of incandescent red. The air roared. The universe blinked. I was on the floor without knowing how. The sanctum had become a negative image of itself. Every lumen bleeding shadow, every shadow luminous. Through the viewport, the rift was no longer a wound, but an eye, lidless and amused. From its center erupted a storm of light, crimson folded over gold, folded over something darker still, an acceleration made visible. I tried to rise, but gravity had lost its contract with reality. My thoughts dragged like treacle. The data slate at my side clicked, its screen alive with numbers scrolling too fast to exist. Infinite decimals, self-devouring equations, the vocabulary of velocity itself. It was running. Not here, not there, but everywhere the warp touched. The crimson filament unfolded into a corridor that had no direction, a smear through the fabric of existence. Inside it, a shape, humanoid, yes, but warped by its own momentum. The face flickered, eyes alight with terror and awe, mouth forming syllables that distorted into thunder. I caught one word only before the sound stretched beyond hearing. Run. Around me the adepts screamed verses meant to bind demons, but the syllables shredded in their throats. A secutari sergeant fired his galvanic rifle into the distortion. The bullets melted into streaks of light that fell upward like sparks. The crimson phenomenon shuddered, split, and duplicated. 2 streaks, then 4, then countless, each an echo a nanosecond behind the other. They laced the sanctum, passing through matter, through flesh, leaving neither wound nor mercy, only a residue of static and ozone, as though reality itself had been sanded smooth. The ship's machine spirit wailed in binary liturgy. The Cantus Ferrum shuddered, decks bowing inward. Calyx's voice, or what was left of it, boomed through the vox, fragmented, stretched across frequencies. Contain, vector, sanctify. The words broke apart like shells on a beach. Then silence. I remember the taste of iron, the sense of motion beneath stillness, the absolute certainty that something alive was now sprinting through the warp's arterial corridors, too fast to die, too lost to stop. I crawled toward the shattered lectern and pressed my slate against it. The net's sensors still recorded, still translating impossible data into something the human alphabet could pretend to hold. One phrase resolved from the chaos: light before storm. Through the viewport, the red streak shot into the rift and vanished. The wound sealed in its wake, not with closure but with satisfaction. The void was silent again, but every lumen aboard the Cantus Ferrum pulsed once, twice in rhythm, like a heartbeat syncing to a distant runner. I understood then that we had not trapped a phenomenon. We had opened a door. The choir lay in ruin, their robes smoldering. The Mechanicus adepts who still lived muttered fragments of catechism as they dragged themselves upright, eyes vacant, faith fraying at the edges. I found Calix's remains near the dais, half metal, half absence. His augmetic skull had caved inward, leaving only a black cavity that reflected nothing. Yet his mechadendrites still moved, twitching in imitation of his last gesture, a hand extended toward the light. I backed away, whispering the Emperor's name like a talisman. The sound made no echo. The ship's voxnet crackled alive with overlapping voices, crew across the decks reporting flashes of red light racing through bulkheads, circuit relays, even bloodstream implants. One voice, a child's octave high, recited a single line on loop. He runs. He runs. He runs. Then came the stillness that follows catastrophe. No alarms, no hum, only the soft respiration of cooling metal. I looked again to the viewport. The rift was gone, but the stars had changed positions as though time had skipped a beat. My slate showed 3 minutes of data missing from the chronometer. 3 minutes erased. The Inquisition's retrieval craft found me days later amid wreckage orbiting nothing. I told them what the sensors recorded, though I spared them the truth of what I had seen. They took the slate, filed the report, and sealed it beneath 10 orders of classification. They called it a warp anomaly. I called it the beginning of something that had learned to move faster than fear. Later, in the privacy of a decontamination cell, I closed my eyes and felt it again, a pulse faint but unmistakable, like footsteps echoing through the marrow of space. Each beat carried a whisper that no vox could decode but every soul could understand. Still running. And in that moment I realized, if the warp is a sea of souls, then something now swims against its current. There are no distances in the warp, only decisions pretending to be directions. The survivors of the Cantus Ferrum, those few whose minds did not fold inward like paper set aflame, claimed the red light was gone. But the warp does not forget movement. It remembers it as hunger. Somewhere beyond the skein of real space, inside that endless psychic ocean, the thing we once called the Flash had been unmade and remade by velocity itself. At first there was only speed. No thought, no self, no voice. Just the instinct to run, because motion was all that remained of identity. He tore through a darkness that bled colors unknown to mortal eyes. A darkness that bent around him like cloth around a blade. Every step tore through a new universe of possibility. Every breath collapsed a timeline. Yet for all his acceleration, he moved nowhere. The warp has no straight lines, no destinations. It curls back on itself, feeding motion into madness. When he realized that, he tried to stop. He couldn't. The Flash screamed, or thought he did. But sound in the warp does not travel. It ripples through memory instead. The scream came back to him as echo and prophecy. You will never stop running. The warp had heard his defiance and mistaken it for invitation. Where the Speed Force had once been a sanctuary of physics and light, this was its antithesis, a sentient storm of emotion and decay. Here, velocity was not freedom. It was consumption. He ran through ghosts of himself. Each step created a shadow, a splinter of consciousness trailing a fraction of a second behind. The faster he ran, the more of himself he left behind. Soon, the warp was filled with them. Dozens, then hundreds, each repeating the same desperate rhythm, all trapped in their own spiraling loops of time. Some begged to stop. Some prayed to keep going. Some simply burned, red streaks twisting into black smoke as demonic claws of thought reached from the ether to taste them. Through this distortion, something began to speak, not with language but with pattern. The warp loves repetition. It feeds on rhythm, on obsession, on the heartbeats of mortals who mistake persistence for purpose. The Flash's run was perfect sustenance, eternal, cyclical, futile. The demons watched him and whispered their judgments, voices overlapping like a choir carved from static, flesh pretending to be lightning. Speed is a lie that mortals tell to deny. Eternity, Each stride is another prayer to us. They began to chase him, not to catch, but to mirror. They learned his rhythm, his cadence, his panic. They folded their forms into mockeries of him, demonic reflections running alongside, their eyes bright with mock compassion. He saw one that looked almost human, its skin a canvas of runes burning blue-white, its grin wide enough to split its skull. It kept pace beside him for an eon measured in heartbeats. "Why do you run?" it asked, though its mouth did not move. "To get home. Where is home?" He faltered, and the warp shuddered, delighted. In the instant of hesitation, the sea of mirrors opened beneath him. He fell, not down, but inward, collapsing through himself. The infinite versions of him, all his echoes, collided and fused, merging agony with realization. In the Speed Force, his motion had defined time. Here, time defined his motion. Every past mistake, every fleeting thought, every forgotten memory became terrain. He was running through his own life, and the warp took exquisite pleasure in turning memory into labyrinth. He saw his mother again, her face caught between tears and light. He saw himself saving cities that no longer existed. He saw every victory dissolve into shadow. The faster he ran, the more those images degraded, faces stretching into shrieking masks, landscapes folding into impossible geometry. The warp was teaching him its first law. Everything that moves eventually returns to itself, only hungrier. Then came the chorus. The echoes of himself, the fragments he had shed, began to sing. Not words, but the pulse of their motion. An infinite feedback of footsteps like the heartbeat of a dying god. It filled the sea, made it vibrate. Somewhere in the dark, demons wept, not from sorrow, but pleasure. They called him the eternal pulse. They began to build temples out of the rhythm, constructs of psychic debris shaped like cathedrals of movement. Inside, warp entities knelt before statues made of red light, chanting praises to the one who made eternity bleed. He ran faster to escape worship. But worship follows motion. Every step through that storm left more afterimages, and those afterimages began to evolve. They developed wills. Some sought to help him. Others sought to replace him. The warp, curious, fed each echo a fragment of soul stuff and watched them fight for dominance. Soon there were countless speedsters, each a reflection, each less human, each louder. The warp rippled with 1,000 runners screaming through chaos. One broke through the pack and reached him. This echo's lightning burned darker, almost black, with veins of gold crawling through it like molten scripture. It looked at him and smiled with something approaching pity. "You thought you could outpace infinity," it said. "You were wrong, but you could become it. What are you?" "I'm what you become when the running stops." The creature reached out. Its hand passed through him, leaving a trail of glassy fire that burned backward through time. Every echo behind them froze mid-stride, frozen images of agony. The creature turned its head, listening to the warp hum in approval. "They'll remember you," it said. "The demons already do. They call you the Crimson Saint." For the first time, the Flash felt something like stillness. The warp had given him a title, its way of keeping what it admires. His light flickered, struggling against the darkness pressing in. He realized then that the Speed Force, his old power, wasn't gone. It was drowning. It pulsed deep within him, a buried sun suffocating beneath the warp's tide. If he could reach it, he might breathe again. But to reach it, he would have to go faster than the warp itself. Faster than thought, faster than madness, faster than meaning. He began to accelerate. The demons screamed into light. The ocean folded. The echoes ignited like stars snuffed out in the same instant they were born. The crimson trails blurred into pure white, burning holes through the fabric of unreality. He was becoming friction itself, devouring the space between seconds. For a moment, just one, he glimpsed something beyond. A structure vast and radiant, like a throne made of light buried in eternity. Around it, faint gold tendrils reached into the storm as if trying to grasp him. He thought he heard a voice through the static. Ancient, infinite, sorrowful. "You do not belong here," then it was gone. He fell again, back into the warp's embrace. The demons laughed like breaking glass. His body, if it could still be called that, glowed white-hot, vibrating between realities. He realized that each time he ran faster, he left more of himself behind. The warp was not merely devouring him. It was copying him, learning him. And somewhere, far away, in the cold metal cathedrals of Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus began to pick up signals, strange frequencies pulsing through noospheric channels, carrying impossible data. At their core was rhythm, the heartbeat of a man running forever, transmitting across the void. The tech priests named it Crimson Frequency 2.0. They believed it divine. But for the one still trapped inside the warp, there was only motion, and the realization that he had become the very paradox he had tried to escape. Infinite, fragmented, and devoured by his own reflection. On Mars, the priests of the Omnissiah have a name for miracles they do not understand: iterations of faith. Every heresy begins as one. When the first signals of the Crimson Frequency reached the Red Planet, they arrived not as transmissions but as hymns buried in static. The sound defied machine logic. It was too rhythmic to be random, too chaotic to be design. To the priests of the cult Mechanicus, that paradox was the mark of divinity itself. And so, under the ochre skies of the Noctis Labyrinthus, they began their greatest blasphemy. The Magi who had overseen the failed Cantus Ferrum project were declared martyrs by decree of the Fabricator General. Their data, retrieved from the wreckage, became scripture. It spoke of a being made of pure velocity, a crimson echo moving faster than cogitation could measure. They called it the Saint of Motion, the one who embodied the machine god's ultimate principle, perpetual function without entropy. To study such a thing was forbidden. To contain it was unthinkable. But the Adeptus Mechanicus has always believed that the Omnissiah reveals himself through forbidden circuits. Magos Dominus Vera Luthix was chosen to lead what became known as the Acceleration Covenant. Her body was more machine than flesh, cables and pistons where once were veins and muscle, her remaining human eye surrounded by bronze filigree. In her personal liturgies, she wrote that flesh was the break upon divinity. She saw the Crimson Frequency not as anomaly, but as proof. That motion itself was the final form of faith. To run without end was to transcend decay, and so she resolved to build a cage worthy of a god. The forge world of Olympus Mons groaned under her will. Massive manufactoria were rededicated, their banners repainted in sigils of velocity and flame. 1,000 Skitari legions worked in silence, their augmetic limbs moving in perfect rhythm to Luthix's directives. In the deepest vaults, beneath the molten channels of the planet's crust, construction began on an engine that could contain light itself, the Voloctrum Crucible. It was a vast sarcophagus of living metal, layered in crystal memory circuits and sealed with psalms encoded in binary prayer. Choirs of tech adepts chanted as sacred oil poured down the machine's flanks, their voices trembling as the crucible awoke. The sound was not mechanical. It was a heartbeat. When it was finished, Luthix gave the order to summon the phenomenon. She believed that if faith and mathematics were one language, the warp could be tricked into answering it. Her Magi built signal towers across the Martian deserts, each calibrated to broadcast the rhythmic pulse derived from the Crimson Frequency, the heartbeat of the runner trapped in eternity. Across the red dunes, the signal sang. It resonated through metal and stone, through data vault and cogitator shrine, until the entire forge world hummed in unison. And somewhere in the warp, something heard it. The first response was light. Thin, crimson threads shimmered across the crucible's surface, forming runes that none had written. Data streams screamed through the noosphere, collapsing augurs, overloading servitor brains. A single line of script appeared across every display. He runs for the machine god. Then the crucible ignited. A blinding wave of energy spread through the chamber, throwing even the augmented Magi to their knees. Inside the sarcophagus, the red light coalesced, first a pulse, then a figure. It was not solid, but suggestion, a silhouette flickering between frames of existence, vibrating so rapidly that its edges dissolved into white fire. The temperature dropped to absolute zero, then spiked to fusion levels in the same instant. Time had no meaning in that chamber. It had become a captive paradox. For a moment, the Mechanicus saw divinity. The silhouette moved, infinitesimal gestures that produced thunderclaps of displaced air. Sparks cascaded like falling stars. When it turned its head, every lumen dimmed, and the machine spirits howled in praise and terror. Luthix stood before the containment field, her vox filter crackling. "You are proof," she whispered. "Proof that motion is eternal. Proof that the Omnissiah breathes through velocity." The figure raised a hand. The containment field trembled. Lightning of unnatural hue danced across the sarcophagus walls, searing runes into the metal as if it were parchment. Those runes read like equations, fragments of the speed force transcribed into the language of the warp. The priests recorded them, each line a new gospel. They began to chant, voices trembling, machine hymns merging with binary prayer. The crucible's pulse synchronized with the heartbeat of Mars itself. Across the Forge world, engines faltered, reactors misfired, and Vox networks bled with whispers. The red dunes shifted as if breathing. Luthix's assistant, a junior Magos named Row 9, turned to her in panic. "The containment is destabilizing," he said. "We are drawing power from the crust. The entire substratum." "It is responding," Luthix interrupted. "The machine god is answering," the crucible screamed. Energy surged through its conduits, brighter than fusion, older than faith. The red figure pressed its hands against the glass-like barrier separating it from its worshippers. Each movement left a burning imprint of human shape on the surface, a handprint, a shoulder, a face. For a heartbeat, those impressions looked alive. Then the figure spoke. The voice was neither human nor demonic. It was vibration translated into thought. "You're slowing me down." The words rippled through the entire manufactorum, through every data slate and cogitator, through the new sphere itself. Across Mars, hundreds of tech priests fell to their knees, bleeding from augmetic eyes. Luthix smiled through tears of oil. "Then we shall quicken the machine," she said. The figure moved again, faster this time. The sarcophagus vibrated so violently that its supports began to liquefy. Data streams went white, sensors registered negative time. The air itself blurred. Luthix's mechadendrites tore free of her spine, lashing in ecstasy. She looked upon her creation and saw godhood. "He runs for the Omnissiah," she whispered as molten metal rained from the ceiling. "And the Omnissiah runs through him." Then silence. The crucible's walls fractured inward, imploding without sound. Every lumen extinguished. The magi in the chamber were reduced to ash, their augmetics melting into the floor. Only Row 9 survived, shielded by the wreckage of a fallen column. When he rose, trembling, he saw the sarcophagus open, its interior glowing with fading red light. The figure was gone. But outside, above the Martian sky, a new light had appeared, a red aurora spreading across the void, coiling around the planet like a crown. Vox networks worldwide filled with static pulses, rhythmic, unending, the sound of footsteps. The Mechanicus called it the halo of motion. The Inquisition called it a contagion. The Adeptus Mechanicus declared the experiment a success. The Crimson Saint had been captured and set free in the same act. To the faithful, it was not failure but fulfillment. The machine god had revealed his fastest face, and somewhere beneath Olympus Mons, in the ruins of the crucible, the melted surface of the sarcophagus still glowed faintly. 5 handprints seared into the metal, each pulsing in rhythm to a heartbeat that was not there. Because motion, once born, cannot die, it began as a whisper in the void, a single pulse like the beat of a heart that had forgotten how to stop. Across the surface of Mars, Vox networks crackled with static, and the faithful fell to their knees beneath crimson skies. The Mechanicus called it divine recursion, the moment when the Omnissiah's will loops upon itself to perfect the machine. But to those attuned to the warp, it was something else entirely, a scream disguised as rhythm. The Crimson Saint's release had torn a seam through the Imperium so deep that it bled motion. The warp is not accustomed to losing its prey. Where once the red streak had been an amusement, a curiosity, now it was an offense, a mortal spark that refused to dissolve. The ruinous powers, ever jealous of dominion, turned their gaze toward the intrusion that dared to move faster than corruption itself. First came the scent of iron and lightning. Then came the hounds. They were not creatures of flesh or matter, but of concepts, demons born from the echo of the saint's flight. Each embodied a piece of what the warp could not contain: rage, cunning, entropy, and hunger. They took form as they fell into reality, their bodies shaping themselves around the human mind's need for fear. One roared as a storm of blades, its presence bending gravity. Another crawled, a serpent made of screaming seconds. From their emergence, the warp shimmered, forming a crimson corridor stretching from the edge of Terra's psychic beacon to the farthest dark between stars. At its center, the runner moved. What remained of the flash, now something neither man nor myth, blazed across the immaterial like a living meteor. His body was a contradiction of light and absence, a pulse of willpower wrapped in the thinnest membrane of identity. Behind him, a trail of molten chronologies marked his path, each footfall birthing and erasing moments of time. The hounds followed, their howls merging with the screams of the warp itself. Every demonic power wanted a piece of him. Khorne saw his endless momentum as a hymn of war, the eternal charge that never finds its enemy. The blood god hurled hunters of brass and smoke into the fray, each carrying swords forged from the crystallized rage of dying suns. They struck at the streak of red, but he outran the swing before the thought of the attack could exist. Their rage only fed him. Tzeentch, ever the schemer, watched the chase with fascination. Here was a being that defied destiny, a mortal who had escaped causality and become the embodiment of change itself. From the architect of fate's realm came demons woven of parchment and ink, their wings scribbled with predictions that rewrote themselves mid-flight. They whispered to the runner as he passed, offering sanctuary, offering understanding. But every word slowed him, dragged him closer to the warp's hunger, and he tore himself free, leaving trails of shredded prophecy in his wake. To Slaanesh, his motion was ecstasy, the perfection of sensation stretched beyond meaning. The Prince of Excess sent legions of liquid light to dance beside him, to tempt him into stillness. "Stay," they murmured, voices soft as breath. "Rest, feel," but he could not. To stop was to die, and to die here was to become a song for the warp's choir. So he ran on. Only Nurgle watched in silence, amused. "Everything tires," the Plague Father chuckled, his laughter dripping like rot into eternity. "Even motion decays." The warp rippled with the chase, its oceans boiling, its storms knotting into spirals that devoured whole psychic realms. Planets near the Eye of Terror experienced tremors not of matter but of time, hours looping, days reversing, as if the universe itself had caught the runner's rhythm. Astropaths screamed as crimson visions flooded their minds, a figure of red lightning sprinting through the Astronomican's flame, scattering the Emperor's light into fractal echoes. For one blinding instant, every navigator in the Imperium saw it. Some fell to their knees, claiming to have witnessed a new star being born inside the warp. Others went blind, their third eyes seared shut by the brilliance of motion. Back on Mars, the Mechanicus called emergency synod. The survivors of the Acceleration Covenant gathered in what remained of the Crucible's data vault. The air still smelled of burned circuitry and sanctified oil. Row 9, now half mad, stood before the assembly, his voice breaking through Vox distortion. "He runs still," he said, "but not for the Omnissiah. He runs because the warp is chasing." Luthix's name was now spoken only as litany, her sacrifice reinterpreted as devotion. "We summoned divinity," said one of the higher magi. "Now the gods themselves have noticed." They stared into the projections flickering above the dais. Distorted footage of crimson storms spreading across the warp, data chants that looped faster than any machine could parse. "It is not just energy," another priest whispered. "It is thought, motion that thinks." The Inquisition, hearing whispers of these heresies, dispatched fleets. Ordo Malleus strike cruisers translated into the Martian orbit, their holds heavy with nullfield generators and psyker execution squads. But before they could land, the red aurora surrounding the planet flared. Voxcoms died mid-prayer. The entire sky turned scarlet, and from the horizon rose pillars of light, ascending arcs of molten code that spiraled into the void. The saint had passed by not in body but in echo. His speed now existed everywhere. The warp brushed reality, and the warp wanted him back. From the Imperium came a wave, not fire, not radiation, but memory. The hounds had cornered their prey in a realm beyond geometry, a bleeding plain made of solid time. The runner slowed, his light flickering. The air thickened into centuries. The demons closed in, their laughter deafening. He turned, ready to fight, though his fist could no longer strike, for there was no matter to hit, only the idea of pursuit. "You can't catch me," he whispered. The hounds answered with a single unified roar. The warp itself tilted, reality bending around the confrontation like metal under flame. Lightning burst outward in all directions, striking both the immaterial and the material at once. In orbit above Mars, ships burned without fuel. In the void near Cadia's ruins, ghostly echoes of him flashed across sensor screens, fragments of the chase bleeding into the physical universe. He ran again, not away but through. straight into the heart of his pursuers. Each stride shattered the forms of demons, scattering their essence into motes of static. But each kill slowed him. Each kill fed the warp more data to understand him. Until finally one creature, vast beyond comparison, a shadow made of velocity itself, emerged from the horizon of unreality. It was him, or rather the reflection of his final failure, conjured from his own exhaustion. The warp had built an equal. For the first time he met something as fast as himself. The two collided in silence, red and black lightning merging, forming a storm so vast it spanned the Imperium. Planets quaked under its ripple. On Terra, the Astronomican dimmed. Across the galaxy, astropaths collapsed, clutching their chests, whispering a name they could not know. And in the void where motion had once been endless, there came a pause. Not peace, not death, just the stillness that comes before creation decides whether to continue. And in that pause, a whisper escaped him. Not of fear, but of understanding. "If I can't outrun it," he said, "I'll carry it." The warp listened, then it began to scream. The scream was not a sound but a texture, a tearing of the medium that held thought together. It rolled through the Imperium like a pressure front, flattening the ornate storm palaces of minor warp lords and snapping the spines of ideas that had crawled there since old night. Where the two streaks met, his crimson and the warp's counterfeit, a black flash veined with bruised blue sigils, reality lost confidence in what should come next. The collision did not throw them apart. It braided them strand around strand, until motion itself became a rope pulled taut between annihilation and will. In that bind he remembered a simple street, rain in the gutter, laughter carried on air not yet soured by apocalypse. The memory was a match. He struck it against the dark. The flame it made was not heat but meaning. For an instant the Speed Force surfaced like a drowned star heaving one last breath. Everything slowed without stopping. He felt every footfall he had ever made stack into a tower of choices. Each brick a life saved, a hand caught, a grief delayed. The warp bared its teeth and tried to swallow the tower whole. "If I can't outrun it, I'll carry it," he had said. And now he learned what carrying meant. Not dragging the warp behind him, but lifting people he would never meet through it. He turned not away from the black flash, but toward the red halo girdling Mars, toward the thin thread of the Astronomican burning like a lighthouse in a storm that hated light. He ran into the false hymn. The collision didn't break bones, they had none left to break, it broke agreements. The warp's equal shattered into concept shards. Fatigue, despair, self-accusation, each flake a precise barb meant to lodge in his stride. He gathered them as he ran, not to wear but to deny, pressing those shards into the wake behind him where his echoes once perished. The demons chasing felt the change first. Their rhythm faltered. A few turned their heads as if a new wind had risen. Tzeentch's parchment-winged courtiers unfurled predictions only to watch them catch fire, as the runner's wake burned future tenses to ash. Khorne's brass hounds found their charge turning sideways into something that could not be charged. Slaanesh leaned closer to taste the limit and tasted refusal. Only Nurgle smiled wider, mossy joy in Rot's patience, and reached out broad arms to offer the only stillness he knew. The crimson corridor narrowed to a filament. It stitched itself through the densest reefs of psychic refuse and the clefts of dead gods' skeletons. Along that thread the runner began to do something the warp despised. He chose. Not flight at random, not frenzy, but selection with intent. He skipped the pits that sang in his mother's voice. He ignored the cuttlefish glare of leviathans wearing his father's silhouette. He sped past chapels built in his name and smashed their bells so their worship would not chain him. Every refusal hurt. Each cost him a layer of red. But in the balance of loss and clarity there grew a new steadiness, a cadence that did not arise from fear. Across real space the proof of it scattered like sparks through wool. In an orbital shrine over Cypra Mundi, a navigator opened her third eye to confirm a course and saw for one heartbeat a hair-thin red line cut across the glare of the Astronomican like a violin string. She sobbed and adjusted bearing by a fraction she could not justify. A pilgrim barge that should have drifted into a gravity well slid past by the width of a coffin, on a guard troop ship grinding toward its 23rd doomed deployment. A child woke from a nightmare with a single word on his lips, run, and the bulkhead beside his cot thrummed once, twice in time with the distant pulse of something that had decided to keep others alive. On Mars, The red aurora convulsed and then steadied. Row 9 stood on a broken balcony above the ruins of the crucible, his robes scorched, his voice box singing static prayers it hadn't been taught. Through the dust he saw 5 handprints still glowing on the melted sarcophagus wall. Their rhythm had been wild a moment before. Now it settled into a pattern simple enough that even a frightened machine spirit might trust it. He laid his palm above the prints and spoke to no one. "He is choosing," he said, the admission tasting like treachery to his creed. "Not to be worshipped. To guide." The sentence did not fit any catechism, but the manufacturum's crippled engines responded anyway, aligning their sputter to the heartbeat that wasn't there. The demonic host, denied the feast of panic, grew irritated. Rage sharpened them. They began to cheat. They folded corridors to place their teeth ahead of him, painted illusions in the seams of his stride, set snares baited with endings he longed for. A room with a coffee cup still warm, a uniform hanging by a door, a voice saying it had always been proud. He bled speed to pass each without touching. His edges flickered threadbare. The black flash reassembled from its fragments and lunged, grasping for purchase with hands made of his fatigue. For a moment it found a shoulder. The grip was not strong. It was perfectly placed. He staggered. The filament bowed toward a pit where the warp had stored millions of small betrayals in amber, each labeled with a name. A human voice cut across the storm. Not thunder, not liturgy. A field report compact and afraid of itself. Logister Savant Marwin Hale, designation archived. The words struck like pebbles at a window. He does not know the name, he told himself, because names ended where universes changed. And yet that tone, the thin steadiness under shock, threaded the filament with a stitch of humanity. He leaned into it. The pit receded. The black flash tore free a strip of red and swallowed it whole. But what it chewed did not taste like surrender. It tasted like road. He broke through the last fold not by being faster but by being exact. Ahead lay the Astronomican's glare, swollen and uneven since the birth of a cicatrix that scarred the galaxy. Navigators perceive it as a coral blaze. Psychers taste copper when they think of it. He felt it as a lattice of intervals, a music written by a dying titan who refused to let his people drift. He did not touch the lattice. Every whisper of rumor says touching it is to die in a way even the warp forgets. But he aligned his passing to its rests, slipping through the pauses where the light inhaled. In those rests he left something small, a tick in the metronome, a hair-thin line for tired eyes to follow when storms closed and faith shook. The Imperium convulsed. The powers reared. For an instant the red filament became visible not only to those attuned, but to ordinary men staring by chance into portholes at nothing. Across a dozen void-docked decks, strangers gasped in unison and then laughed, unsure why. The demons swarmed, but swarming requires a center, and he had left them none. He was a scatter of correct decisions, tracing a path no hunger could simplify. The black flash swung wide for one last ambush, and found only after images, each empty, each an honest mistake left like a decoy. He felt the cost as he cleared the beacon's outer turbulence and dove back into deeper dark, to drag another thin line somewhere a lost ship might need it. The cost was not pain. It was subtraction. The man under the lightning was a handful of memories and a vow. The Speed Force still pulsed, but it had changed color, tempered by a storm it would never understand. He did not know if he could stop. He did not know if stopping would end him or everything watching him. He knew only that the choice to carry had multiplied into a duty he could not articulate. The warp, thwarted and educated, folded its hounds back into itself and considered. New games would be designed. New equals would be cast from his shadow. Patience is a kind of motion. The powers have plenty. But as the storm subsided, 1,000 minor predators slunk away to lick the taste of refusal from their tongues. And for a handful of human heartbeats, the ocean felt thinner, less certain of its monopoly on forever. On a Chartist freighter limping blind between systems, a junior astropath traced a line and spilled recaf with a fingertip and set a course she could not justify. The ship missed a death it had already written for itself. On Terra, a custodian guard standing watch over a hall no map dares draw felt the faintest brush of wind in a place without air and inclined his head a fraction, as if acknowledging a courier who did not stop. And on Mars, 5 handprints cooled to iron, their last heat sinking into the floor like a seed. He ran on. Not faster, not slower, just right. The scream dwindled to a rasp. In its wake, something like a rumor lifted its face to look at the dark and wondered if a line could be a road. He was no longer sure what it meant to move. The notion of speed had folded inward until it became prayer, a rhythm without destination, an act sustained because to stop was to unmake everything stitched behind him. Around him stretched the gray calm that follows a storm, the warp in remission, its colors dimmed to the pallor of smoke after lightning. He felt it watching through 1,000 unblinking eyes that now understood they could not close him. In that stillness, he realized he had run beyond pursuit, beyond even light. The Astronomican flared behind him, its music now carrying a faint counter-melody he had left there, a heartbeat for the lost. The warp tasted the note and recoiled. Faith had been smuggled into its bloodstream. What passed for laughter trembled through the void. Disbelief, resentment, reluctant awe. He was not their captive nor their prey. He was the scar they could not heal. He looked down, if down had meaning, and saw the galaxy sprawling beneath, a wheel of embers spinning through nothing. The sight should have crushed him, yet it steadied him. Every world, every breath, every terrified whisper was a measure in a song he had refused to let end. He felt the urge to stop and watch, to let the moment wash through him. But motion had become his tongue, and the universe still needed its translation. He traced one last line. It began near the dying heart of the maelstrom, where the storms never sleep. He cut through it like a needle through torn cloth, leaving behind a thread of red that shimmered against the bruised black tides, ships adrift there, Imperial, Xenos, even the silent Necron tomb vessels, recorded a flicker passing faster than auger sweep, a warmth that kissed their hulls before vanishing. In the data vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, cogitators calculated an anomaly traveling at impossible vector and wrote in the margin, "Saint of motion, manifest again." He did not see them. He saw only the line, the path he would leave, a single stroke from one end of creation to the other, a reminder that even in corruption's heart, there had been resistance once. The warp murmured. Korn's laughter guttered into silence. Tzeentch rearranged his feathers and found no strategy to erase what had been written. Slaanesh wept, tasting the flavor of a perfection it could not own. Nurgle, slow and patient, simply nodded. "All things rot," he whispered. "But sometimes the rot blooms first." The runner smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding. Motion decays, yes, but in decaying it seeds the ground for more motion. Perhaps that was all eternity required. A single contradiction kept alive. He felt himself thinning. The red around him paled to gold, then to transparency. The speed force whispered across whatever remained of his mind, gentle as tidewater. "Come back." He answered without words, only direction, down toward the worlds that still prayed to distant stars. The warp screamed once more, but it was the sound of distance, not possession. Somewhere within the labyrinthine spires of Terra, deep in the hollow lungs of the palace, a scribe fell asleep over his parchment and dreamed of a figure running across the sun. When he woke, the ink upon the page had formed a sigil none could later reproduce. 2 lines crossing, one vertical, one diagonal, glowing faintly red before fading. He wrote beneath it, "Mercy passes its speed." On a pilgrim ship lost between beacon flickers, a child pressed her face to a viewport and gasped. Across the void, a crimson shimmer curved like the tail of a comet, and for a breath her heart beat in perfect time with it. The navigator corrected course without knowing why. Days later they broke warp safely, the crew swearing they had followed a red angel. The ecclesiarchy would burn such stories as heresy. Yet within the secret sermons of a few confessors who had looked too long into the storm, a rumor took shape that sometimes the Emperor's light does not appear as gold, but as motion, an act so fast it becomes compassion. They called it the light that wasn't there, and in the silence after the rumor's telling, when the candles burned low and the incense thinned, those confessors would feel the faintest vibration in the floor beneath their knees. 3 beats, then stillness as if something vast had just passed by. Far beyond the Imperium's edge, beyond the last whisper of the Astronomican, he ran through darkness unlit by any faith. Each stride left a resonance, a pattern carved into the warped surface that would take millennia to fade. He did not run from anymore. He ran for the ones who would never know his name, for the moments that required saving without witnesses, for the promise that even in endless night, There could be a trace of direction. He looked once more at the galaxy and felt the warp press closer, eager to reclaim its silence. He let it. The red line behind him glowed brighter, then dimmed until it was no more than the memory of light. He became the pause between lightning and thunder, the breath before dawn, the heartbeat before hope. And somewhere, in the black between stars, the warp shivered, not from fear, but from the knowledge that it was no longer alone, because something was still running.